Ooh. Started recording and it got very quiet.
Chair Spokley, we now have a quorum of members, just so you know, so when you're ready at 1:30, we can start if you'd like.
Sounds perfect. Thank you, Lynette. We'll go ahead and wait a couple more minutes and we'll get going. All right, I show we are right at 1:30. Welcome everybody to the June 4th Land Use and Natural Resource Committee meeting. I'll go ahead and call this meeting to order. Lynette, do you want to do a roll call for us?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Just as a reminder, this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on our website. And that is the way that the public is accessing this meeting as well. Members of the public who are participating by phone or our committee members participating by phone, if you would like to speak, please press *9 to make a comment. And then we would ask our committee members and presenters, if you are not speaking, please remember to mute your device so that we don't have feedback. I'll go ahead and take roll. Director Flores. Appears that he's absent. Frost.
Here.
Jankovitz.
Here.
Kennedy.
Here.
New.
Here.
Onderco. I don't see him. I'll mark him absent. West.
Here.
Vice Chair Gallardo.
Here.
Vice Chair Tixa.
Here.
And Chair Spokley.
Here. Thank you very much, Lynette.
Sorry, Chair Spokley, I believe you're muted.
This is really starting off well. Not only did I start talking with the mute on, as I often do, I skipped over the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you would all please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. There we go. We got our flag on the screen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible,
with liberty.
liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Next item on our agenda is public communications. Lynette, do we have any members of the public who would like to address this committee?
We don't have any that are currently on the line that I'm aware of. However, we did receive a public comment, which I sent to all of the committee members yesterday. It was a letter from the city of Sacramento regarding agenda item number 2, which concerns the REAP item, which is the regional planning funds, which Ms. Hargrove will address later. I did just want to bring that to our attention. Otherwise, I don't have any public comment.
Perfect. With that, we'll move on to our first action item on our agenda, and that's the meeting minutes from the May 7th, 2020 committee meeting. Does anybody have any comments or motion related to those minutes?
Move to approve.
Second. From Frost.
You got that, Lynette, who made the motion?
Sorry, I just need to know who made the motion.
That was me, Director West.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Director West. I believe because we're doing this virtually that we have to call roll as well for this item. Lynette?
Yes, thank you. Director Flores? Absent. Frost?
Aye.
Jankovich?
Yes.
Kennedy?
Aye.
New?
Aye.
Thank you. Onderko? I don't see Director Onderko. West?
Yes.
Vice Chair Gallardo?
Yes.
Vice Chair Tixa?
Yes.
Chair Spokely?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to our second item on our agenda, the draft framework for regional early action planning funds. Jennifer, I think I saw was, yep, she's joining us. Jennifer, do you have a presentation for us?
I do. Yep, I'm gonna start sharing my screen. 1 second. Okay, here we go. Yep. Good afternoon. I'm excited to be here today to talk to you and request your recommendation to the board on the framework for how we spend our remaining regional early action planning or REAP funds. The action for you today is actually quite lengthy action request, so I'll let you read it on your staff report, but it does include adopting the framework as well as the resolution that would be required for us to apply for these funds from HCD, as well as approving the planning, the procurement, and the agreements that are needed to implement the framework. We've talked a lot about REAP over the last few months in this committee, so I'm going to skip a lot of the background, but I do want to just give a quick reminder about the guiding principles that we've set forth as we look at how to spend these funds. We've talked about that the REAP funds should be used to support the 2020 MTP SCS, should help plan for and accelerate more infill housing and more housing product choice, and also leverage future funding opportunities such as Green Means Go. With that, I'm going to jump right into the proposal that you have before you today. The first box here, the first 25% of funds, you'll recall that we got board approval for that back in March. So we are moving ahead with that work, actively working with HCD right now to finalize our agreement with them, and then we'll be dispersing those funds as shown here. So it really is this middle box, this remaining 75%, approximately $5 million is what we're here to talk about today, and what the draft proposal you have is really about. The proposal is minimally changed from what the draft that the committee saw last month. The primary change from what you saw last month in the framework is a slight reduction in some of the funding. This is a result of HCD's guidance to us on South Lake Tahoe. You'll recall that last month I mentioned that our full REAP dollar amount, the $6.7 million, is based on our region's population. And when that formula was being created, South Lake Tahoe's population was included as part of our region in creating that dollar amount, but they're not, as you know, actually a part of our region, a member of our COG. So we've been working with HCD and the city, and the recommendation is from HCD is for us to pass that funding through directly to the city. So that's here. And then as a result, some adjustments have been made to the framework to accommodate that. So now I just want to go over the components of this middle box, the framework that we're talking about today. And I'm going to go in reverse order. So I'll talk about the staff costs, then the competitive grant, then the non-competitive grant, and then the Civic Lab series. For the staff costs, as you can see here, we are proposing about 5% going towards staff costs. That's administrative work, as well as the staff costs to prepare and run all of the other components. I'm happy to elaborate more on the staff time and cost if the committee wants later, but I'll transition into the competitive grant. And I do want to quickly just pause here. If you're following along on the screen, you're seeing the right information. If you're using the slide handout, that the PowerPoint handout that's posted on our website, this slide was titled wrong. So I'm looking for viewers who are following along at home. I'll just say, this is the slide with the regional map. It says infill areas in the right-hand corner. The top of the slide that's incorrectly posted online says non-competitive grants for $2.8 million. This slide is actually for my explanation of the competitive grant at $1,727,000. So this portion of the REAP framework is trying to put forth this idea of a competitive grant. This grant would be targeting planning and activities related to housing in our future green zones. Again, going back to our guiding principles for the REAP to support MTP and Green Means Go, where it makes sense, we think that focusing some funds and these planning activities in our future green zones can really help advance those areas for any potential future Green Means Go funding. The framework before you today is really setting this competitive grant up at a very high level, basically allocating the funds to it and directing staff to go forward and create that funding round. Certainly a framework will need to be created, a process, an application. All of those things will still come through the committee later this fall, or perhaps the Transportation Committee later this fall as we talk about the regional funding round. The next piece of the framework is a non-competitive grant, and that's approximately $2.8 million. This would be funding for a wide range of housing activities that would be available to each jurisdiction based on their RENA share. So as shown in this table, the dollar amounts scale up as the units that you're planning for under the RENA scale up. These non-competitive grants would have a very simple application process, not even really an application, just a letter to us about how you plan to use the funds so that we can just ensure that it's consistent with this framework as well as the state expectations for how we're spending this these funds. And then finally, the framework talks about a Civic Lab series. This Civic Lab housing series really is intended to be a support system for the other two components, right? We want to provide some workshops and technical assistance to really support and supplement the work that the local agencies will be doing with their REAP funds. So we've talked about this last month. This is a mini accelerated version of our Civic Lab series that would be complemented with some technical assistance and geared directly to your planning staff. the framework shows the table that I have on the screen here, which is just examples. It's just an illustrative table to show you the idea of we would come up with a topic, we would host an online workshop on that topic, and then we would provide some technical assistance related to that topic. And in the end, we'll narrow down to 4 topics, and we'll work with your jurisdictions upon approval. If the framework is approved, we'll start work with your jurisdictions this summer to really narrow in on what are the 4 topics and what is the technical assistance of most value to our region, and really get going on this Civic Lab series. That's the framework in a high-level nutshell. I do want to go over the draft timeline quickly and then just touch on some of the feedback that we've received to date. So the calendar here is not very detailed. There's a lot of variables at play still, but essentially, once we get that first 25%, our goal is to get that out of the door very quickly and then be in a position to apply for the remaining funds from HCD. And then our goal is really, again, to start with that Civic Lab housing series as soon as possible this fall. And then for the non-competitive grants, where again, we're just requiring a letter of how you would intend to use the non-competitive funds laid out in this framework. That would be, we want to make that as painless as possible. So we were looking at like maybe October through January, just having an open call where jurisdictions can submit their letter at any point during that time. And then really starting in February of next year is sort of the target for that competitive funding round. Later today, I'll be talking to you about the green zones and a framework for really adopting the regional green zones by December. And so starting and being ready for a competitive planning grant program sort of right on the heels of that is the intent of this. And then finally, I just want to talk briefly about the local agency review and the comments that we've received on this framework. We've had an open comment period. All jurisdictions have received the framework. We hosted a webinar. It was really more of an informal meeting of all the housing planners so they could ask any questions, give us any feedback. We've gotten several sort of no comment or okay or just clarifying question comments. And then we did receive the letter from the City of Citrus Heights that was included in your packet as attachment C. And then yesterday, as Lynette noted, we received a letter from the City of Sacramento that was emailed to you, but is also posted online as handout 1. So hopefully you've had a chance to read those, but I'm gonna turn it back to you to get started on your discussion. If you want me to summarize or respond to the letters, I'm happy to do that, but want to give you the space to ask any questions about anything and start your discussion.
So Jennifer, before we jump in, I guess I would like you to summarize the Citrus Heights and the City of Sacramento letter and what their concerns or comments were, if you don't mind.
Sure, yep. I'll start with the letter from the City of Citrus Heights. Their letter really was, it was requesting that it likes the idea of the non-competitive funding and requesting that those funds be allocated not based on your RENA allocation. So as I just mentioned, that table that I showed in my presentation really is laying out how much money each jurisdiction would get based on their RENA share. And the city's letter is suggesting that gives more funding to growing communities and doesn't recognize the challenges that some cities like Citrus Heights face where they're nearing build out and they don't have these outward expansion opportunities or plans. Their letter also is concerned that a competitive grant concept is too resource intensive and leads to winners and losers. So their suggestion is to remove that competitive grant that's targeting the green zones and put that funding all into the non-competitive pot and again, changing the formula that we use for that. I think, you know, a lot of the points of their letter we agree with. We kept the competitive base funding as part of the staff recommendation, again, because it aligns with the guiding principles that we've set forth for this funding. We certainly understand the need of the local level to receive the majority of these funds. But as your SACOG staff, we do see this as a real opportunity for our region. The state did decide to give this money to regions, so we see this as an opportunity to really demonstrate our understanding of the unique needs of our region and really innovate. So we think that the Civic Lab series really, and that competitive funding round is our shot to do that. Together, these two pieces, the Civic Lab housing series and the competitive grant, is about 27% of the total REAP funding. So we do think we're being responsive in that the majority of the funding, approximately 65%, is going directly allocated to member agencies. And to the point of not using the RENA as the basis for the formula in which we're allocating funds, the purpose of the funds just at the state level really is to achieve housing element compliance and accelerate housing production. So the RENA seems like the logical point for allocating those funds, but it's also a comment that we heard. You'll recall when we were going through the RENA process, we had a few board members speaking up to this point exactly. And that's really where staff took the cue and put the formula funding to tier, or to use the RENA as the basis for that. You know, the city makes a really good point about accelerating infill housing. And we do think that the framework addresses that already. Many of the eligible activities have a nexus to infill areas, or even a requirement that they be in infill areas. So I think we're in alignment with that part of the letter, and just feel the framework sort of already addressed it. And then the City of Sacramento's letter is appreciating some of the steps that we took to hear their earlier concerns about not for the non-competitive funds, making the application process very simple, making the Civic Lab series available online, and it's sort of a mini version of it. They appreciated those parts of the framework and hearing some earlier concerns that we had heard from planners. Their letter likes the RENA being the basis for the formula of the non-competitive grants. They do note that it's sort of capped. If we didn't cap it, you know, the city at 30% of the RENA, or just under 30% of the RENA, would be eligible for significantly more money if we just took it straight as, you know, 30% of the full 6.7 million, they would get 1.5 million. So they just note that we have this cap in place, but my impression of that letter is not that they're advocating for a change to remove that cap. I think they're just simply demonstrating their preference for keeping the formula based on the RENA and demonstrating their need. Though I didn't get a chance to confirm that with them directly. Just in the letter, I didn't read a direct, like, please change this, or we recommend that. So between now and the board meeting, I will make sure I get a hold of the city staff to make sure I'm interpreting their letter correctly, but it doesn't have an exact recommendation. It just points out that they like that frame. They like the idea of basing it on the RENA allocation and what their funds would be if we didn't put some guardrails in place.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for going over those quickly. I've got one quick question, and then I'll open it up to the rest of the committee for questions. Tell me again, what's going on with South Lake Tahoe and the need to directly funnel money to the city?
Sure. Yeah, so when the Regional Early Action Planning Program was created at a state level, they looked at giving money to each of the state's COGs and then Council of Governments, and where there isn't a COG in place, the law actually spells out for the remaining areas how they get their funding. And in writing that law, and then in the subsequent figuring out how much funding each region would get, the city of South Lake Tahoe's population was included as part of the SACOG region. But they're not a member of our COG, and we don't include them for really any of our planning purposes. And so we didn't realize that was the case early on in REAP. And so once we realized that, we talked to HCD, they admitted it was a bit of an oversight in the way that the law was created, but so much of REAP is written into statute that you can't change it that easily. So in talking to HCD and the city of South Lake Tahoe, HCD's recommendation was take the proportion of money that was included in our 6.7 million that is really as a result of the city of South Lake Tahoe's population and pass it through to the city of South Lake Tahoe.
So the amount was determined based on population alone?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you for that, Jennifer. I'll go ahead and open it up to other directors' questions.
I have a question, Chair Spokley.
Director Frost, please.
In your report, Jennifer, in the non-competitive, you mentioned the in the event that the funds do not get distributed, they would be applied to competitive funding. And I was wondering, do you generally not distribute all the grant funds on a non-competitive basis? Has that happened before? I'm just trying to figure out how that could happen.
Yeah.
If you have to compete and you get the money, does that happen?
That's a good question. Well, I don't think we've had this direct experience before, but so I don't expect it to happen. I put it in there with sort of any remaining funds out of the Civic Lab housing series that don't get spent, and any funds that, if a jurisdiction decided that they didn't need those funds, or they didn't have an eligible activity to be able to use them in the time frame that we have ahead of us, that the remaining balance would be put into that competitive pot, in part because it's the last thing we'll be doing. So we'll have a sense, that everybody is planning to spend their funds or not. And then whatever's left, we want to put in there. We just don't want to leave any money on the table in terms of the 6.7 million that we're getting from HCD. So at any point, if the Civic Lab series comes in a little bit lower funding, or even from the first 25%, if we haven't used all that funding, just any opportunity, we wanted to just put in how we would plan to spend that so that we don't have money left when it goes back to HCD. But I wouldn't anticipate that anybody would say, no, we don't need that. It's just a matter of, it's not a narrow list. It's a pretty wide list of activities, but they are housing related. You have to be planning for housing or doing a process change that supports housing, or streamlining or reducing fees. And, so a jurisdiction could choose that they don't have an opportunity to spend those funds right now, but probably unlikely. You're right.
Yeah. Okay, and that's it for right now.
I have a question. This is Director New.
Director New, go ahead.
Thank you. It's a question for Jennifer, actually. Who can write the letter? Can I write the letter to the, okay, we don't have a housing person any longer. And I'm not sure that the city manager is interested in infill. And I don't know why he wouldn't be interested in $40,000, but I can write the letter, and that's all I want to know.
Yeah, and yes, actually, I'll just elaborate. because we want to make sure the city or the county or whoever that they are committed to using the funds. So we actually require the letter be signed by either the city manager or a council member or a board of supervisors. Then that way, it's great if you have a housing planner, but we do want that level of commitment. So that's who signed the letter.
Very good. Thank you.
Anybody else have questions for Jennifer on this item?
Through the chair, this is Alexander Tista. Jennifer, sorry, when did the letters need to be sent in by?
That part of the calendar is subject to change, but right now
Okay.
we're looking like October through January, sort of any time in that 4-month period, you would get it to us. I think by August, we can come back and have a better sense of exactly the time period for when you can do that. But that's what we're looking at. I will say, if you're thinking and planning ahead, there's some ability to back bill, sort of invoice efforts you will maybe already started on that are consistent. Sorry. If you're thinking ahead, October through January, but what I was clarifying is the REAP funds themselves coming from HCD actually allow some amount of back billing. So if you're ready to get started on a project right now and it seems consistent and that's what you're planning to use it on, we can have a conversation. And even if you're applying later, you might be able to use some of that to cover things you're doing right now.
Any other questions or comments? I'm not seeing any hands or anybody else speaking up, Jennifer. Did you get it?
Matt,
Yes.
Sue Frost, are you asking us to just basically, you're basically asking for guidance if we have ideas that would change the way you have proposed this?
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yes, that's correct.
I mean, in some areas like Citrus Heights and Sacramento, they have big challenges with their regional housing needs. I guess everyone does, but so this is going to be important, even though it's not a huge amount of money. But there will be some really great things that can be done with it. And I think it seems pretty logical the way you outlined it. I mean, I don't really have any, I can't think of any major things that pop out in my mind as a problem, I guess. So that's my thought. If that's what you're looking, is that what you're looking for? How we feel about this thing?
Yeah, and then it is an action. So we would be requesting that the committee take an action to recommend this framework and all the components of it to the board. And then the full board would act on it in 2 weeks at your board meeting.
Okay, and will the board at that time have the discretion to make, adjustments subject to the conversation at the board level then?
Yeah.
Or it'll,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, James can correct me, but it won't be on the consent calendar. It'll be an action item for the full board to have a discussion about. If there's, minor changes, you can make actions that way. If there's a major discussion, we can talk about what that does to the calendar if we need to bring it back.
Yeah, I would say, Director Frost, you always have that chance, right? Even if a committee acts on something, even on consent, you could always pull it off consent. In this case, regardless of what you do today, we actually wanted to make sure this was an action item because we think it does deserve discussion amongst all the board members. There is a little bit of a calendar. Jennifer just hinted at this, but we would like to be able to get this approved so we can begin some of this work since we feel some sense of urgency around it. And it does connect, by the way, to You'll hear later in your meeting today, green zones connects to your commercial corridor efforts and revitalization, and it connects to our efforts around Green Means Go at the state level. So all of those things I think are actually a really nice synergy. But yes, to answer your question, you can weigh in, the board can change things. You always have that ability.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments for Jennifer? All right, I'm not seeing any. So the action before us is on this framework. If we don't have any other comments, I'll certainly entertain a motion.
Move for approval. This is Director New.
Frost, second.
We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? You know what? I'm sorry. I'm going to back up. We have a motion on the table. Lynette, do we have any members of the public who'd like to speak on this item?
I'm not seeing that we have any.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry about that. Let's go ahead and move forward then with the vote, if we could.
Thank you. Director Flores? Absent. Frost?
Aye.
Jankovitz?
Yes.
Kennedy?
Aye.
New?
Aye.
Onderko? Absent. West?
Yes.
Vice Chair Gallardo?
Yes.
Vice Chair Teeksa?
Yes.
Chair Spokely?
Yes.
Motion carries.
All righty. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll move on to informational items on our agenda this afternoon. Item number 3 is Sustainable Agricultural Land Conservation Grant Program. Looks like Renee is going to be giving us this presentation.
Yes. So good afternoon, Renee DeVere-Oki. I'm your RUX project manager, taking over from David.
Hey Renee, I can barely hear you.
Okay, let's see. How about now? Is that better?
A little better. There you go.
A little better. Okay. Just give me a shout if you can't hear me. So I'm your RUX project manager. I took over from David. So this is an information item today on an upcoming grant opportunity that SACOG is considering applying for. So the Department of Conservation has kicked off its 6th cycle of its Sustainable Agricultural Conservation Program. The acronym for this is SULC. So this is a program that receives a continuous yearly allocation of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Funds. It is a sub-program from the Strategic Growth Councils. It's their Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities Program, kind of their agricultural conservation arm. So the SALT program features 2 types of grants. There's a land acquisition grant and a planning grant. SACOG is interested in submitting a potential planning grant, which would be in alignment with our RUX 2.0 efforts, as well as in support of our economic prosperity strategy work that we've been doing for food and agricultural sector. So the SILC program, it's looking to protect ag lands that support infill and compact development, and also further the purposes of AB 32, specifically by avoiding increases in greenhouse gas emissions associated with the conversion of ag land to non-agricultural uses. The program funds projects that support the development of local and regional land use policies, as well as economic development strategies to protect critical agricultural land and lands that are supportive of agricultural at systems level, such as uplands and lowlands and connections with our food systems. The SALT guidelines describe and are looking for projects that would identify priority land for conservation, projects that would focus on maintaining the economic viability of the region's agricultural industry, and support the region's sustainable community strategy, including development of local plans that support greenhouse gas emission reductions and efforts that promote infill development. So noting that these are the emphasis areas of the program, SACOG staff is exploring the concept of a project, which would be for SACOG to work with local and regional partners, agencies to identify priority conservation areas in the 6-county region. So this would be analogous to the infill green zones that are under development for the Green Means Go. You'll be hearing a little bit more on this item later from Jennifer. The priority conservation areas could be agriculture areas or areas that are supportive of agriculture. The effort, kind of as we were envisioning it, would be to rely on existing research and analysis and lessons learned from our rural-urban connection strategy work to date. We'd be building on what we know of ag in the region, what we've learned from our groundwater studies related to specialty crops, and what we know with our upland lowland connections in terms of water supply and the interplay of our farm to market systems. We design and execute a process that would identify valuable agricultural resources in the region and policy recommendations for maintaining, enhancing these resources. We see this as a potential way to work strategically to integrate with local plans, our SCS and pending habitat conservation plans. So what I'd be interested in today is any feedback the group has on this initial concept idea. This actually is our first outreach on this idea. We have reached out to your local planning staff to see if there is any other local jurisdictions that are proposing an application for the SALT program, and we have not heard of any of those at the moment. Also, I'd be interested if you have any recommendations for stakeholder coordination or consultation that could be helpful in a project of this style. Our application wouldn't be submitted till the end of August, so we have the summer to put this together and do some of the partner outreach and shape and craft what we'd be moving forward with. And then I'd be coming back in the August cycle for a resolution that would go along with the application that we need to submit. So I know that's a lot of information, but I'd be happy to respond to any questions or take any comments that you have on this.
Thank you very much, Renee, for your presentation. I've got a quick question, maybe just a clarification. In the staff report under background and analysis, the statement is made that one of the cited goals of this program is to protect agricultural lands to support infill and compact development. Is this like a, can you describe that? I'm not sure I'm following exactly what is being said there. It doesn't make sense to me.
Oh, so overall, it probably lines up better with the land acquisition grants, is that it explores trying to fund those lands in particular that are at most risk for conversion to development that may be agricultural now, but if they were converted would then increase VMT and result in greenhouse gases. So on that side of the program, the land acquisition part, that's what it's looking at, is kind of the fringe development there. The planning grant that we'd be looking at would be potentially identifying where are those areas or other areas that are supportive that we know are necessary for the agricultural economy that we were trying to promote in the 6 county region.
Renee, if I can elaborate just a little bit, I think you've got you've got it pretty well there. I think the idea behind protecting or enhancing or making our agricultural lands and our working landscapes more productive and more viable. The idea behind this grant program is that would help them withstand potential future development pressure. So if we can make our working landscapes productive, if we can enhance the economies there, beyond the land acquisition, right? If you purchase that land, it's out, you can't develop it. But beyond that, the planning side of it is if you can develop policies and plans that are going to enhance those areas and make those areas more productive and more effective, that would help them then withstand future development pressure. I think that's the logic behind that part, that statement that you asked about. Does that make sense to you as well, Renee, on your read?
Yeah.
So there's existing programs that are in place that I think do very similar things that this program would strive to do. So let me try to just describe a scenario, and you can tell me if I'm thinking about this right. If I've got a piece of land and it happens to be farmland today, I want to develop it, so I put a plan together. Is the intent here for that developer who wants to develop the farmland has to go and find property elsewhere that's prime ag land and then put it into some program so it's preserved? Is that the premise here?
I don't think this isn't like a land banking or like a mitigation strategy so much where if you want to develop here, you can't have net loss, and so you go and you acquire land elsewhere. This program is a little bit more just about protecting existing ag land and working landscapes. So it's not an effort to prevent net loss of agricultural land. It's to protect and enhance the agricultural land that is there, short of being a mitigation measure. I think the establishment of these priority conservation areas, for our region, I think it kind of does three things. One is it sets us up for potential for local jurisdictions to potentially go after these land acquisition grants in the future. It's kind of a foundational step along those lines. Having these areas, I think our region already has a bit of a culture with our blueprint to focus on infill development and filling in our existing communities and protecting our agricultural lands. So this kind of puts a punctuation mark on that existing culture and maybe identifies and adds some additional strategies to how we're enhancing our agricultural lands to complement our infill goals. And then, and all of that is beneficial as a narrative, as a storytelling point when we're going after other state and federal grants, because that is quite frequently something that they're looking at is what are your plans for your rural lands. And then the third thing is I think our existing funding round, our regional funding program already includes some performance criteria or an outcome about enhancing our rural spaces and enhancing farm to market routes and things like that. This doesn't necessarily add an additional outcome to our regional funding program, but it does add an additional tool in our toolbox for how we can demonstrate that we're meeting that performance outcome. So I think those are the three main things it does for us. But I don't think it is intended to serve as that kind of mitigation bank as you were asking.
Okay, thank you, Clint. Appreciate that. I'll go ahead and open it up to the rest of the committee. Does anybody have questions for Renee on this item? Renee and Clint on this item?
Yes, through the chair. This is Director Pizza.
Go ahead.
First, I'd like to say that this means we'll be working with our old friend, David. Is he on the? Isn't he the head of the California Department of Conservation?
Yes, he is the director of the Department of Conservation. One thing we're noticing is a lot of his language has made it into a particular style of program.
And I really appreciate this work and on this subject. But one question I really have, which is important in our community, since the city did develop on ag land and it still is, there are certain areas where orchards have been surrounded by development and even schools. So it's really hard for them to irrigate, spray, do anything. And a lot of these orchards are full of trees. So my question is there any way that with land acquisition that the city or, for example, school district, well, I don't know if the school district can use these funds, but the city can use those funds to purchase the ag land and maybe convert it to any use, because we're finding in our situation, the farmer that works the land, he doesn't own the property. He's just secondhand. He just works, he manages it, and he has difficulties with that orchard because it's right next to the high school. They can't spray. They really can't water. They're surrounded by a senior home. It's really, and it's a difficult place, but he tries to manage it as best he can. And even he knows that the people who own the land do not live in Live Oak. I believe they live in San Diego. It's in some family trust. And it's really difficult to do anything with that land, and it's a lot of great acreage. So I was wondering if something like this grant program can work in our situation.
On the land acquisition portion, I mean, it could have the potential. Once again, it is like, it's competitive, so you have to make sure that you're telling the story that what it's trying to do is actually keep it in agriculture. So if that is kind of the intent, I'd definitely be happy to talk to you offline on this in greater detail if that would be helpful.
Okay. I mean, unless they can do it some different version of farming, I guess, because farming walnuts, it's difficult in that location. So maybe if they convert it to something else, maybe that would be better. All right. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.
This is Director New, and I have a question.
Go ahead, Director New.
Thank you. And this may take some time offline, but I'll state the question. We have a landowner who has land producing quite well almonds, and they're very healthy production, but he also owns the acreage directly next to it, which is in the city limits, and he wants to annex that. He wants us to annex it. And he says he can't develop it. Well, it's true. It's in a floodplain. He could fix the floodplain and solve his annexation, or solve the problems of his land in the city limits. If he's keeping his property in agriculture because he can do the flood control in the agricultural area, would that qualify? Is that something that we should look into?
It seems like that does have the potential for a project with the land acquisition. Even potentially on the planning side, if you needed to do the kind of analysis to get there.
Mm-hmm.
I would need to double check to see if you can still at this point apply for the land acquisition side, because I know there was a project concept that needed to be submitted. So I can double check and get that information to you if you'd like that.
I'd appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions for Renee or Clint?
This is Sue Frost, and I this kind of rings a bell with some of the conversations that went on at Cal LabCo, a conference a couple years ago with some jurisdictions in California that had actually created these, I guess, habitat conservation, and it wasn't like an HCP like for mitigation purposes. It was, and I guess the benefit of it, part of the benefit they talked about was that the ag lands that they were preserving were all in one place together, so you wouldn't have some of those challenges that Director Tixa was talking about, because the ag is in this one large area. But are you talking about something where this would be something you would invite people who want to submit, who want to voluntarily, because this basically puts a limit on their property rights, right? It changes their ability. Then they no longer have the ability to change the way they use their property if down the road, if they wanted to. Is that correct?
So that, if you were to put it in the conservation easement acquisition side, kind of the narrative on the planning side of what we're thinking is that we've done large amounts of research looking at what ag exists in certain places. We also know where floodplains are. We also know where potential good sites are for doing some groundwater storage. Also, there's new data sets that have come out for high-risk wildfire. So kind of along the planning lines, we're thinking on a regional scale, wouldn't it be kind of interesting to stitch those together? So that could give you a technical lens of looking at different areas where you could see, okay, are these areas that would be better to put as priority conservation areas in the future, noting that they maybe have these different circumstances. However, what we'd want to do is definitely work with local jurisdictions to see if it's perhaps an opt-in. Does this area make sense? The plan wouldn't subscribe you to putting this into like a conservation easement acquisition portion. If you wanted to do that later, you would then apply for a different program. Does that make sense?
So what you're saying is it would be like different cities have moratoriums and different rules on what you can build and where you can build it and how you can build it. That's just another way to plan the layout, do your land planning, basically.
Yeah, it's just to provide another like kind of informational source, maybe join some different policies that what works in one community wouldn't necessarily work in another. But if we were to take these and kind of stitch them together, it would give us an eye for looking at a new approach. Local jurisdictions could use that information, apply for grants, even fold that into a future general plans.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Renee.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions from the committee?
Oh, actually, how did the Farm Bureau feel about this? How do the farmers feel about this?
We have not directly outreach to the farmers on this. I mean, the Department of Conservation has held several webinars where people can participate. If you are a property owner, you can opt into it, as well as nonprofits. We as an MPO, this is our first kind of opportunity where they've opened the door to us just to apply for a planning grant. So that we're kind of new into this particular program, but farmers and nonprofits have been kind of part of this since the very beginning. We're in cycle 6.
And to that point, Renee, this grant program emphasizes strong partnerships and stakeholder outreach as a pretty critical component of any of the planning work that you do. And so one of the things we wanted to hear, and Director Frost, you just gave us, some direction there, is any ideas you have on stakeholders that we ought to be or partners that we ought to be reaching out with. We partnered with Valley Vision along with others on the prosperity strategy. Valley Vision is a good potential partner on something like this because they have connections to some of those agricultural contacts and like the farm bureaus and things like that. So that is a critical part of this planning grant application. And if any committee member has other thoughts or ideas or folks you want to make sure we're reaching out to or engaging as we are developing this application and then going through this planning process, either those comments today or reaching out to James or Renee or myself, where we would could really use that additional guidance as well.
Well, thanks, Clint. I was just going to say, it seems like it's pretty that agriculture is a broad term, a very broad term. It's not just growing food; it's production and packaging, and in some cases you run into conflicts over someone's production around something else. Trying to think of an example, but the smells, air quality, there's all kinds of things that can come into that conversation around agriculture. And so it's kind of a big topic. So when you say habitat conservation, are you conserving it? What are you conserving it for? All aspects of agriculture, or is that left open and that's what we're going to determine as we move forward?
I think in part this is how how we would, or what we would be aiming for as we move forward with something like this. So the priority conservation area designation, we would be wanting to work very closely with local staff on your existing plans. What we'd be looking to do, and part of what the grant is looking for us to do, is to develop policies and strategies that would help protect and enhance our agricultural sector and our food systems. And as Renee said, that those strategies or those policies are not going to be a one-size-fits-all for every community. And so I think part of this grant program is identifying those areas in our region that are critical for our agricultural sector, our food systems, and then identifying the appropriate strategies and policies to keep them productive and keep them vibrant and keep them an important part of our regional economy. And so I think what we'd be trying to accomplish is get to some of those, the answers to some of the questions that you're asking, Director Frost, about what are the best strategies to maintain different parts of our agricultural sector, different parts of our working landscapes in the region. And there are most definitely going to be conflicts when you have agriculture and urban areas next to each other. There are conflicts. I think some of this grant would be looking at that interface. In fact, that rural-urban interface is one of the things, one of the elements that this grant is looking for you to address through the planning, through this planning side of the program.
Thank you, Clint. Anybody else have any questions or direction? I do have a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think the idea, obviously, of preserving our agricultural areas in our various counties is a very important thing. I would just want to make sure that we're not doubling up on through these planning efforts and identifying these priority agricultural areas. We're not doubling up on programs that are either in place or creating additional regulation for folks who do want to do something different with their land. And I see the dichotomy there. You can't develop your land to houses and preserve the agricultural aspects, but there are programs that are in place. There are HCPs that are out there that are setting aside big swaths of habitat and other things. Our next item, we're going to be talking about some housing things and programs and things we want to look at to try to help make housing more affordable, at least in one aspect. So I wouldn't want this to become just another program, another thing that that people who own land, who've owned land generationally, who have made the decision that they want to do something different with the land and get out of farming. Yeah, I'd hate to see it inhibit a family or a property owner from doing what they want to do with their property. So I get it. This is a brand new thing for us, a brand new program. I'm open to kind of hearing some more about it. You asked for input on potential stakeholders. I think we've got to include development communities, because I've got quite a few clients who, like possibly the BIA. I've got a bunch of clients who have owned land for decades, and they've been farming the land through leases to farmers. Something like this, if a plan was developed that said, okay, you're now prime agricultural land and we're taking away their rights that, that they've been planning to do with the property for a long time, that will be problematic, I'm sure, for a lot of folks. So Building Industry Association, land developers, there's probably a half a dozen or so large, long hold land developers that would be interested in what this program's all about. Those are just a couple of thoughts I had, Clint.
Director Spokley, this is Sue Frost.
Yeah,
I just want to say I agree with you, and I also want to say there are a lot of farmers, agriculture people who own farms who cannot sell them because you couldn't buy it and make a profit. You couldn't pencil, you couldn't turn a profit on based on the cost for the land in California and the cost to run the farm or whatever. The same with agriculture, with cattle, which is an important component to agriculture. And so that was part of what the HCP, why the HCP was so good. It was providing mitigation. And for those that, for some people, it was providing some extra revenues and a revenue source that would augment what wasn't working anymore. And they were going to actually have to figure out how can I retire, or how can I can't sell this as a farm, because you can't, someone can't buy it and make a profit in today's world. So I think you're right. I think it is a property right, goes to their property rights, and but we do want to preserve our rich farm agriculture community. That's a major part of our California economy. So I get the importance of this. I'm just saying, I'm not quite sure how this is different than the mitigation. Adding the mitigation component provides a revenue source that in some cases can make it work for farmers or cattle people.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think just to clarify, because I think you both are bringing up really good points that that I think are worth just a quick clarification. The priority conservation areas that we're talking about, a really critical first step in that is to understand, because we have a patchwork of these protections around our region already, right? There's Williamson Act, there's habitat conservation plans. There's a patchwork of regulations and protections already in place. A critical first step is understanding and mapping all of those, so we have an understanding of what is already protected in our region. The layer that we're talking about of priority conservation areas, this is not a program to set, this planning side is not a program to set aside that land. It's really more about the economic viability of those lands. To get to your point, Director Frost, this is really to identify what's protected out there, what's not protected out there, what is currently doing really well and productive and viable economically, and then what needs a little bit of help to become more productive, more viable, and then what policies and strategies might we have for these priority areas, because we have our priority infill areas, and Jen has talked about the various barriers to infill development. Well, there are barriers in our agricultural lands as well to them being able to stay in business and keep the family farm in production. This would really be identifying those areas and seeing what types of investments and policies and strategies can help. This planning part is not about setting those aside so that you can't do anything different with them in the future. The land acquisition side is more about that. The planning side is more about policies and strategies to enhance those areas. Does that kind of help address? I think both of you had a similar vein of thinking on what we were doing with this.
Yeah. Now in Sacramento Valley, some of the agriculture community is thinking about Napa Valley and how they turned that into a wonderful tourist attraction. The vineyards and the ambiance and the glass of wine by the lake or whatever, and then all of a sudden you smell something happening next door that you didn't plan on. So you're right. I mean, there is planning. So I get what you're saying. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that helped me quite a bit as well, Clint. So thank you for that. All right, we're running a little long on this one, so this is just informational. Renee and Clint, thank you very much for the presentation. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we will move on to our next item, which is a discussion on future housing workshop topics.
Okay, this is Greg Chu from the housing team.
Hi, Greg.
Also with me is Dov Caden, in case there's any questions that he can help with. So the purpose of this topic is to kind of recap kind of some discussions the committee's had earlier about housing topics and then what topics it wants to talk about in upcoming meetings. So in March, the last time the committee met in person, staff kind of gave an in-depth review of the technical assistance that it is providing to your local jurisdictions. We've been meeting with your housing planners for the last 2 years now on a regular basis. Even after the RENA was adopted, we still meet every 2 to 3 months as needed. So at the March committee meeting, we kind of summarized the technical assistance and we kind of put it into 2 different categories. One was the assistance to help local jurisdictions achieve their housing elements. And then this kind of second category of assistance is what SACOG can help jurisdictions with just getting housing produced and developed. So in that discussion, which was went for about an hour, the committee kind of gave some feedback and we heard kind of 6 broad categories of topics that committee members mentioned as wanting to hear more information on. And the question before you is, out of these, which ones would you like on the higher priority side of things? So really quickly, the 6 are, first, the Housing Community Development Department from the state is going to be releasing guidelines on housing elements and kind of the new rules and changes in legislation and so forth. And the committee had requested maybe a summary of what it means to elected officials. What do these technical changes mean as far as policymakers' standpoint? So that guidance is going to be released. We're expecting that relatively soon. And at least at the staff level, we feel like that's probably the topic that probably would be of the most interest to you, particularly since housing elements are due in May of 2021. This would be a very timely topic. A second topic is we talked about streamlining and by right the housing approval process, more housing legislation focused on that and ways of getting housing produced. A question that came out of a good discussion that came out of the committee was what's the public engagement process and how do you get public buy-in on a process where that's more streamlined and more approved by right. So that's something that we think is also a high possibility of interest. A third topic is accessory dwelling units. That's something that just about every jurisdiction has mentioned as a possible strategy for their housing elements. And we do have a great analysis on how to figure out what sort of, what's allowed in your housing element for accessory dwelling units, but also what's just some of the technical challenges of doing ADUs, setbacks, and some of the other technical aspects of that. So we could talk about that. And that's also something that we think might be of high consideration. There was a general comment about, what's the framework or mindset of the state legislature when it comes to housing policy and kind of all the changes that have happened in the last 3 years. So we kind of give some different viewpoints on that particular question. A fifth topic is housing choice in high opportunity housing areas. We did an expanded version on the missing middle housing in front of the full board back in September. And this would be a little bit more expansion and a little bit more of the nuts and bolts details of what real communities are doing to get missing middle housing in. And then the sixth topic that generally came out of the March meeting is right sizing parking standards. Different types of development have different situations and finding the right parking situation. That's something, parking is one of those technical issues that has come up again and again is finding the right situation for that. So with that, those are the 6 topics. And again, at least at the staff level, we believe that the housing element compliance is probably the top priority. The accessory dwelling units may be the second, just because it's so widespread in amongst our jurisdictions. And then the by right development process and the public engagement might be the third. But that's the question for the committee is what sort of topics would it like to discuss? So again, your housing elements are due in May of 2021 next year. And we're just looking for kind of what the relative priorities are of these. These could bleed into 2021. It doesn't necessarily have to happen in this year, but at least for a while, we may be meeting by Zoom. So we realize that there may be some limitations in how much time the committee has. And with that, Dov and I will be glad to answer any questions or hear any feedback.
Thank you very much, Greg, for the presentation. So I want to make sure I heard you correctly. You kind of gave your recommendation or staff's recommendation on what I thought I heard to be the top 3. You had the top 3 bullets that were kind of your choice, right? For
That's correct.
The 3 items to focus on. Okay. Let's open it up to committee members. Do any of our directors have questions or comments on what they think priorities should be on this item? All right.
I thought that, this is Sue, I thought the topics that you chose were pertinent to what's going on today.
Thank you, Director Frost. Any other comments? Director New?
Sorry, I was muted trying to talk. The missing middle part, I think, is important, at least for my community, because we don't have much imagination here, and we need a little more insight into other things that we could be doing. But we may be just one jurisdiction out of many. So, but I want to at least get that out on the table. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Director New. Anyone else? All right, Greg, I'll give you my thoughts here. I guess item 1 raised a question and concern for me. HCD is coming out with new guidance on housing element updates, or is this
coming out with updated guidance because of the changes in state law in the last 3 years or so, and then it's been 8 years since the last housing cycle. They're trying to give more clarity to jurisdictions on what it is that they are asking for. And as they did the reviews 8 years ago, there's probably a lot of things that they kept getting questions on over and over again. They just need to release that document to help.
The reason, well, that was a question. The concern I have is we kicked off our consultant to update our housing element, boy, it was a while ago. This is just clarifying, maybe consolidating some of the questions they've been getting through this process. We're not going to have to redo or do anything differently, are we? Do you think?
I hope not. Hopefully HCD will just clarify some areas that are ambiguous, even to jurisdictions that have been preparing their housing elements. There's some ambiguity in some of the laws, as well as interpretation. As much as anything is how's HCD interpreting the laws on these? And hopefully it makes things easier, and your jurisdiction won't have to go back to revise anything. But if it does, hopefully it will be for the better, so that you don't get caught on something.
Okay. thank you. So I guess I agree with the first one. The ADU thing, we've gone through this in my community based on the state law that was passed last year or earlier this year. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I do think that that needs more conversation. A one-size-fits-all plan like the state has passed down to all of us is, in my opinion, problematic for my community. Because of our extreme fire risk, fire hazard area that we live in. Putting ADUs 4 feet off property lines is too much, in my opinion. So I like the ADU bullet. I think the last one, the streamlining the processes, for me, that one's good, but I also like the legislative side of things, because so much of the process is hung up with regulation that's passed down by the federal government and the state to our local jurisdictions. And I don't know, maybe a blending of the second bullet item, which is the streamlining, and the environmental legislative side of things. I don't know if that's possible, but that fourth bullet for me is a biggie, because that drives so much of the costs that we see, which put many of our housing opportunities out of reach for so many Californians. So I'd like to see those couple talked about if that's possible.
Yes, and when the staff discussed these bullets, it definitely remembered your comments about the regulation, and that is embedded with the state legislative environment. So yes, that would be part of that.
Great. Anybody else before we move on? Greg, anything else for us?
That's it.
Bob, anything?
Nope, that's it.
Great. Thank you guys very much. Appreciate it. And we will move right along to item number 5, the green zones to support Green Means Go. Looks like we're coming back to you, Jennifer.
Yep, coming to me. I'm just going to I have a very brief presentation on Green Means Go, specifically the green zones. As you all know, we've talked about this a lot. Green Means Go is an important strategy for reducing vehicle miles traveled and also achieving our 19% greenhouse gas emission reduction target. But it's also a strategy that's going to help us revitalize our commercial corridors and main streets. It helps to preserve ag land. It helps better utilize existing and public assets and infrastructure. It'll help us accelerate more housing production. At a very high level, the Green Means Go strategy is 3 things. They're almost at this layered approach, and we've talked about this before. It really starts with increasing and accelerating infill development, and then layering on transportation options, and then electric vehicle infrastructure. And Green Means Go really is about this targeting an investment in a specific place to achieve the goals that we just talked about. So step 1, we see step 1 as for a place-based investment strategy. Step 1 is to identify those places, and that's the green zones, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. At a very high level, we've talked about the green zones needing to be in infill areas. This is our MTP-STS community type map, in which the red are centers and corridors, and the gray are the established communities. Together, these make up the infill areas of our region. The reason we're focused on infill really is, again, because we know VMT can be reduced on a per capita basis when you have a number of these conditions in place. So when when there's a density of people and things, and there's a mix of uses closer together, and you have transportation options, you can see VMT reduced on a per capita basis. And those characteristics are more common in established and infill areas. So that's why we're focused on these areas with this program. Today in your staff report, there was a draft framework provided in attachment A. That is a draft framework for establishing these green zones. The key components of the framework you have are that, again, it must be in an infill area as defined by the MTPSCS, and then that it must have local policies to support growth. We had I presented to the committee back in March, I think, or April, about the green zones and the idea that they really do need to have this local support for more growth in the area that you're nominating. And as a result, we see this process for identifying green zones really being led by cities and counties, right? You know your community best, you know your policies, you know where you want to be supporting and encouraging and incentivizing infill growth to happen. So we really will be looking for you and your staff to tell us where those areas are. We will have an online application to collect that information, but it's going to be as simple as it possibly can be, right? What's a map of the area? Tell us a little bit about the area and why you're choosing it. We will also have a mapping tool available so that we can just put out all of the data and information that we have and know from all of our modeling efforts from the MTP, so that your staff, as they're looking at designating green zones, they have a plethora of information to be considering. The framework before you is a draft. Depending on any comments, concerns, questions that you have today, we can make some refinements, but then really our goal would be next week. I would hope to send this draft framework as well as the draft application to all of your staff, as well as our partners and interested stakeholders for like a 5 to 6 week review period, so that everybody can understand what we're trying to do with the green zones. They can understand the nomination process, what the application was going to look like, and then we would come back to the committee in August requesting an action on a final framework. If the board approved that framework in August, we would very quickly turn around and start this process, requesting that local agencies get those nominations and work on their green zones and get those nominations to us over the fall, so that by December, we would be requesting the board action to adopt the regional set of green zones, which again, if we get future Green Means Go funding, these are the areas that would be eligible. And then tying it back to the REAP item that you acted on earlier today, that competitive pot of money, the $1.7 million, we would be looking at starting that in February and really targeting these green zones for planning areas. With that, this is just a information item for you today. As I said, we'll be starting a much broader process to collect comments from every jurisdiction, plus our partners and stakeholders in this effort over the summer. So just information today, but would love to hear if you have any questions or thoughts about the framework before we get ready to put it out into the world a bit more publicly.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for that presentation. Just a real quick comment, and then we'll go to the directors for their questions. Obviously, the pandemic that we're all struggling through right now has, at least for my business, profoundly changed the way that we look at working remotely. I know it's early, but I would imagine as we come out of this economic shutdown that we're all in the midst of right now that companies like mine and even some of the high-tech companies at least are indicating that some folks aren't coming back for a long time to the office, which means that VMT is going to be substantially lower than otherwise we would have seen. Are we far enough along? Do we have enough, or do we have data that shows us what kind of reductions we may see coming out of this? I get it, it's early and we're still in it, so we won't know for a while, but I got to believe, at least for my company, I'm going to have 25 or 30% of my people who just prefer to work at home 2 or 3 days a week. And we figured out how to do it well, so we're going to let them.
Yep. We had a very similar question this morning at Transportation Committee, so I'm going to let James answer it because he did so good this morning. So, James?
That's a lot of pressure, Jennifer. I love that setup. Yeah, thank you, Chair Spokley. As Jennifer said, Director Soon actually asked this question this morning. We touched it in the context of our greenhouse gas targets and emissions in the VMT. And also just a nice preview. We've kind of shorted her the last couple of board meetings, but Monica Hernandez will be presenting an item on a very near term. We're in the middle of regional telework initiatives, so that as offices, as you say, begin to gradually reopen and have to reopen gradually, slowly, in a phased way, in a staggered way, that we can actually be thoughtful and intentional about encouraging telework, making telework part of how we do business. So we do have numbers actually, and Monica, I'm sure, will share those at the board meeting in 2 weeks that are pretty staggering in terms of the drop in VMT. I don't have to tell any of you that we never want to see such a drop in VMT and improvement in air quality through an economic depression. That's not the goal. But as we come back, as we reopen, hopefully as we recover, the question is, can we get some of that telework and get some of those VMT benefits to stick? And so stay tuned for that, because, and even I would just, I know it's not on the topic, but if you have thoughts about any employers that might want to get into some of our focus group or a pilot program, it's very sort of Civic Lab oriented. That said, these green zones are the places where we think long-term, and it's not just about the core of the region, right? We have them all over. And as Jen has showed some really nice data to you before about every single jurisdiction has this kind of infill. There's multiple benefits for doing this. It's reducing VMT, but it's trying to revitalize these old corridors. It's trying to do economic development. There's small business, entrepreneurship. So there's a lot of reasons to do these. We still think that there's, over and above the VMT benefits, there's a lot of co-benefits.
Great. Thank you very much for that, James. One last quick question, and we'll open it up to the group. I think all of our member jurisdictions submitted something initially to SACOG supporting the Green Means Go, and I believe projects were identified. Are we able to, based on your presentation, Jennifer, and what these green zones are set out to do, are we able to modify what we originally submitted?
Yes.
In that initial, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the goal. Those were for examples, and I do see probably a lot of them will become the actual green zones that folks nominate, but you definitely get a chance to relook at that and decide if you have different ones or more ones or less ones or changed ones. Absolutely.
Perfect. Do we have any other questions for Jennifer from the committee? Director Du.
I just want to ask Jennifer, when you send out the information, we have no housing person, who are you going to send it to?
John, I always send it to your city manager.
Okay, would you just notify me some way that it was sent?
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you, Director New. Do we have any other questions or comments for Jennifer?
Chair Spokley?
Yes,
It's Jill Galdo.
go ahead, Jill.
I just want to follow up, and I don't know much of the question is just my input. I think you're spot on the numbers about people not coming back to the traditional office. Now that this door has been open, I think people have found ways to work from home, and I think that they'll continue to work from home. If you look at our state workers, we're already seeing that door has completely opened up, and there'll be a large group of folks that work for the state that aren't commuting downtown anymore. But also our schools, they're talking about doing staggered schedules for students now. So not only may they not be coming into work or into school, but it might be different times now. It might not be the 8 to 5 anymore. They might come in for half a day, or the schools they're talking about every other day for students. So I think that's going to be the piece we really need to nail down, is to see, are there going to be some changes? So maybe our traditional rush hours will have some less pressure on, but also just seeing how they're going to service and getting that information from people to find out what's the change going to be. But I think the percentage is going to be very high that don't come back to the traditional way they worked or went to school.
Thank you, Director Galdo. Do we have any other questions on this item? We are running a little late. Sorry about that, everybody. Jennifer, thank you very much for that. We do appreciate it. Moving on to our next item, which is an update to the Sacramento Regional Park and Trail Strategy Development Plan for Victoria.
Yes, good afternoon. Victoria Cacciatore, and here to provide an update on the Regional Parks and Trails Plan, which is our opportunity and then also to build off of the long-range plan, the MTPSCS. We know that trails and open space bring many benefits, from mental and physical health to also being a legitimate way for people to travel to work, to school, for errands, or even just for fun. And this plan is meant to be how we purposefully create the connected regional trail network that will equitably benefit our many residents. This is also taking place during a time when trails are a critical resource in communities who are figuring out how to adapt to social distancing requirements and other public health mitigations. From a Rails to Trails Conservancy survey of trail managers last month, trail systems are being used more than ever previously recorded in their history. And nationally, numbers of trail users have spiked nearly 200% compared to last year. So we know that there's definitely an appetite for expanding our existing trail system and increasing the access to more people.
Hey, Victoria, if you can hear me.
So we have a number of notable sites, which shows that we're yes, help and around in the afternoon. So apologies for any weird robot shorting out that's happening.
Yeah, so you've got your camera off now, Victoria. Let's see if it works now. Yeah, I'm not sure this is going to work, Lynette. Victoria, if you can hear us, we can't hear you at all. We can see your screen if you're the one sharing the screen, but we can't see you or hear you, pardon me.
Victoria, I'm going to try calling you in by your cell phone. So hold on just a second, see if we can add you in that way.
Thank you, Eric.
Great. Is it working better now?
Nope.
It's not. If you could just mute your phone or your computer audio and answer your cell phone, should be able to connect with us that way.
Okay, that sounds good. Thanks.
And while we're waiting for Victoria to rejoin us, I just want to let our community members and members of the public know that the presentation is posted on our website so that you can access it there.
Thank you, Lynette.
Okay, let me see how I can adjust.
Please turn the speakers off on your computer.
Yep. So a fun side note, I used to be a radio DJ back in college, and I must have played a song very much like that during my experimental music DJ days.
All right, we can hear you well, Victoria. Please proceed.
Well, that's a relief. Okay, so you can see the picture that we have right now. Let me try to pick up where I left. Actually, did you catch the beginning introduction? Or did it miss all of the audio?
You were kind of the robot thing going on, so you might back up a step or so and lay it on us.
Great, will do. Great, so this is an update on the Sacramento Region Trails or Parks and Trails Strategic Development Plan, which is our opportunity to continue building out multimodal options in our region and support our MTP SES. We know that trails and open space bring many benefits, both from mental and physical health to also being a legitimate way for people to travel to work, to school, for errands, or for fun. And this plan is meant to be how we purposefully create the connected regional trail network that will equitably benefit our many residents. And this is also taking place during a time when we know that trails are a critical resource in communities that are figuring out how to adapt to social distancing and other public health mitigations. From a Rails to Trails Conservancy survey of trail managers from just last month, trail systems are being used more than ever previously recorded, and nationally, people are seeing the number of trail users spiking by 200% compared to last year. Okay. So I think that you guys have control of the presentation now? Yes. Or my apologies, it's a bit confusing for me. All right. So here, I want to acknowledge that we do have many great trails in the region that are being used, but we are looking for the ways that we can grow these regional assets and expand access to them for more people in the region. And here we have a picture of the American River Parkway that I found on a Visit Sacramento site, because for one, I don't have the ability to get up in a tree and take these aerial shots, but I thought it was very interesting that this is something that we're already promoting as a reason for people to come visit our region, and it's something that you can see a lot of people are enjoying day to day, especially during this time when there are so few activities that are sanctioned and safe for people to do. All right, next slide, please. We already have a great alignment of parks and open space with our existing trail network. Indeed, over half of the existing trails that we have do fall in some sort of park or open space land. This is largely due to the vision of past implementers to create these resources for people to go enjoy our existing green spaces throughout the region. And while that has strong implications for both the recreational potential and the health outcomes of people who use the trail system, it can make using a trail for the aforementioned trips to get to work or to get to the shopping center to pick up some groceries, something like that, can make those trips a little bit more challenging, possibly longer, but it isn't impossible. And it also provides a great, more comfortable facility for somebody who's learning how to ride a bike without the threat of fast-moving traffic moving along beside them. I'd like to point out that we do have a dearth of trails that are in the flood control and water management areas, which represents an area that our region will probably want to grow toward, because when we look at where our local planning documents say that people want to get to, 6 of the top 8 destinations that are listed for trail networks and open space enjoyment are waterways in our region. Rivers like the American, Sacramento, Feather River, Cosumnes River, and then even Folsom Lake is listed as a priority destination that people want to be able to connect to. Next slide, please. Following our update of where existing trails are in the region and where we have trails planned, we started analyzing who has access to these trails that we have located in all the different counties, and we found that less than half of the region lives within a half mile of a trail of any length. It's about 48% of the people, or 48% of the dwelling units can be found within a half mile of an existing trail segment. Of those existing trail segments, we found that only a quarter of the existing trails are located in disadvantaged communities as defined by our MTP SES. This is in comparison to about 37% of the population that lives in the environmental justice areas identified from the MTP SES. And on top of that, we know from our analysis that people living in the environmental justice areas are more likely to bike, to walk, or to take transit for their various trips throughout the day than people living in non-environmental justice areas. So without trails to serve them, your residents have no choice but to use the on-road networks that may be uncomfortable at best or at worst unsafe. What we did notice when we started analyzing who has access to the trails is that there was a high instance of very short trails that, from the best that you could tell, they were too short to provide any connectivity benefits to residents. So we started looking deeper at the data that we had about trails, and to try to get a little bit closer to what trails are going to be providing some sort of connectivity benefit, or at least are long enough for a person to go out and walk for a little bit, we set a threshold of looking at access for trails that are a half mile in length or greater. That's roughly comparable to a 10-minute walk without any needed hustle. So when you look at how many of our 495 miles worth of trails are connected, they're longer than a half mile, this decreased our total trail mileage by about 7%, or really only a little over 30 miles. But it had much more significant impacts on who is living near a trail. If you set in that threshold of a half mile trail, so a trail that maybe has potential for connectivity or is giving you enough space to walk to where you might be able to get your heart rate up for a little bit, it decreases from 48% of the dwelling units in our region live within a half mile down to 40%. That's 76,000 households fewer with access to a trail that might help them make some of their daily trips. Next slide, please. And we are looking at how we create a regional network, and that means that we are going to have to work with partners throughout our region. Our next step in this work is, over the summer, working with our local agency partners and then other invested partners in the communities to identify more of the on-the-ground conditions. Next slide, please. So we'll be working with people in smaller geographically based technical advisory committees so people can all focus on the areas that are in their community instead of everybody coming historically to a meeting in downtown Sacramento and being forced to wait for several minutes to get your turn to talk about what's specifically happening in Auburn and what the connections that you want to make there are. And so we're looking at how we can both vet the groundwork that we've established, learn more about informal trail connections, such as the on-road access that you might have, some of which is really high quality, and others that maybe your local staff has some plans for how to improve it to make it a more comfortable access and increase access to existing trails. And then also look at the opportunities that people want to explore for new connections and how to connect our trail system together. And then what we expect to be able to do through these is to use this local input to inform the regional priorities that we can then use to identify our connected trail network. And next slide, please. So this is an overview of what we're looking to do and how we'll be working with agencies, and then also bringing information back to the SACOG Board of Directors to weigh in on how this regional trail network and the future implementation of it takes shape. So from this update, we'll be working with local agencies and other local partners for how we determine the priorities and bringing back some recommendations for you to consider toward the end of this year. Following your direction on how we should link up the regional networks, such as what goals are important to emphasize with different alignments, and thus choosing what we would want to emphasize with our connectivity. Next slide. In 2021, we would expect to identify the final regional trail network alignment. So what is in the trail network, and then what is other, like what are the other more locally serving trails that, while important to the community, don't necessarily fit into almost what we've previously referred to like the interstate highway system. If we're going to form a trail network that is going to be responsible for linking our region together, there are going to be priorities and preferred route alignments that we're taking from the local plans that everybody has adopted with both existing routes and future routes that you're looking at. And then following the adoption of the regional trail network in early 2021, we'll then look at how we develop criteria for prioritizing different segments that are yet to be built of the trail network, and how we also improve connections to it. Since with some areas, they're largely built out, there aren't many opportunities for building a new Class 1 multi-use trail that's going to meet all of the Caltrans design standards. But perhaps there's an opportunity for an increased high comfort facility that's going to connect neighborhoods to the existing trail network or future trail networks. And it'll use a combination of, say, the separated bikeways and sidewalks. So there's space for people to bike and walk without running into each other. So I realize that we've been running a little bit late and lost additional time and probably a bit of goodwill with the technical difficulties, but I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Do we have any questions for Victoria on her presentation? All right, Victoria, thank you very much for the update. We're running long because I was talking too much, I think. So really do appreciate the work you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
All right. I think we have one more file, a receive and file. Any other items that the committee wants to bring up or talk about? James, do you have any quick updates for us?
Chair Spokley, I would just give you a bit of a preview. It kind of goes back to the green zone item. One of the things that we're finding doing a lot of work with your staff in these kind of infill areas is just how much infrastructure is needed to allow for some mixed use and some housing in these areas. So we're having great conversations with folks like Regional Water Authority, the PCWA, some of the flood control agencies. And we are really trying to pitch a lot of what we're finding in Green Means Go now as a job creation stimulus kind of effort, both at the state level, but also at the federal level. You'll hear a little bit about that at the full board meeting. But I would just say back to your green zones and REAP funds. There's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be fixed and upgraded. There's a lot of scoping and planning and EIRs that need to be done. And I think we've really discovered that over the last, it's really become clear the last couple of months, just how much work is there and how many resources your staff and other agencies need to get those things to be kind of at a state of readiness. So just a preview for the board meeting.
Thank you very much, James. I didn't mention at the beginning of the meeting, I figured I'd do it at the end of the meeting, obviously the tragic death of George Floyd and the protests and kind of horrific aftermath that's been going on since that tragic death. Just want to wish all of the committee members the best. Hopefully your jurisdiction is calm and protests are peaceful and we all get through this safely. So everybody be safe. The funeral for Mr. Floyd services were today. So thoughts and prayers out to all of you. Hopefully everybody's safe as we get through this thing together. That's all we have. Thank you everybody for joining, and we will see you guys all at the board meeting.
Thanks, Chair Spokley. Thanks for saying something about that. We appreciate it.
No problem.
Thank you,
everybody.
Hey, everyone.